For many players, both new and old, the way that decks are named can be very confusing. This video will explain some of the most common naming methods. While this isn't always followed, and many of the ways decks are named may seem random, there are some common conventions for naming them. The way names are created for a deck is meant to convey the basic idea behind it as quickly and easily as possible. One way decks have been named is after the first player to use that deck in a large tournament. The deck Sligh was named after the player Paul Sligh, who was the first person to use that specific type of deck. Another common way to name decks is by basing the name off of an important card in that deck. The deck Living End has its name because the entire deck is designed to get the largest advantage possible with the card Living End. One of the most widespread naming conventions is to base the name on the color of the cards that are in it, although there are many ways to specify the name further. The most prevalent color naming convention is to state all of the deck's colors. For example, a deck that plays red cards and blue cards would be a blue-red deck. There is a word for every possible color combination within a deck, which is sometimes used instead of the base color. For example, a deck that plays blue cards and red cards would be known as an Is-It deck. Is-It Blitz, a red-blue deck based on quickly defeating your opponent in one turn through use of a powerful combo, is an example of this. One way confusion for a deck's name can arise is when the deck plays one or two cards outside of its primary colors. This can be approached by naming all of the deck's colors, although it may lead people to believe that a color has much more predominance than it actually does. Another method is to only name the deck's primary colors, even if it might utilize more than just the ones named. A third method, which is a hybrid between the two previous methods, is to name only the deck's primary colors, but state how many total colors are in the deck. A good example of this is 4-color Jund, which primarily uses red, black, and green mana with a small amount of white mana cards thrown in. Another way to name decks is to base it on the overall strategy or archetype of the deck. For example, a deck that seeks to end the game as quickly as possible could be called an aggro deck, while a deck that seeks to win the late game could be called a control deck. Naming decks based on its specific goal is very common. A deck that seeks to get as much mana as possible may be called a ramp deck, while a deck that wants to put its opponent's deck into their graveyard could be called a mill deck. Decks can also be named by what they are mainly composed of. In the modern format, there is a deck that plays only creatures with the subtype human, thus it is called humans. In addition, in the legacy format, there is a deck that plays primarily lands, thus it is called lands. Other times, decks have the names they do because those names are left over from earlier iterations of the deck. For example, the first deck by the name of Affinity played cards with the Affinity keyword mechanic. As the deck evolved, it got to a point in the modern format where it played barely any cards with the Affinity keyword mechanic, but the name stuck. Finally, decks can have their names because it is a pun or a joke. A good example of a deck with a pun for a name is that of Caw Go. The deck was part of the Draw Go archetype, which got its name from drawing cards and then saying go to pass the turn to its opponent. Because the Caw Go deck played the card Squadron Hawk, it was nicknamed Caw Go. In most cases, a combination of these methods are used. Most commonly, though, a deck's colors are used in conjunction with its archetype. Examples of this include blue-black mill, green-red ramp, and blue-white control. In the case of blue-white control, it got its name by being part of the control archetype and by playing white cards and blue cards. There are many ways to name decks. Some are better than others. This video has not gone into every detail, but it should give an overview of how deck naming works. I hope you have a better understanding of these methods and how to apply them yourself.